Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping back in time, into the mud and the horror of 1916, to try and understand one of the deadliest, most brutal battles in all of human history, the Somme Offensive.
Nothing really captures the feeling of this battle better than this quote from a German officer who was there. He said, "Somme, the whole history of the world cannot contain a more ghastly word." For the men who fought there, it wasn't just a river in France. It was a word that meant hell on earth.
So you have to wonder, right? What was it about this one battle that seared it into our collective memory? Well, let's unpack the flawed plans, the unbelievable carnage, and the complicated legacy of this 141-day nightmare.
Okay, to really get this, we need to rewind to late 1915. Imagine the Western Front. It's this massive scar of trenches stretching all the way across Europe. It's a total bloody stalemate, and neither side can land that knockout punch.
So, the Allied commanders get together and they cook up this huge, ambitious plan. They decide they're going to launch a massive joint French and British attack along the River Somme. This was going to be it, the big push, the one that would finally break through the German lines and maybe even end the war.
But then, everything changed. A massive wrench is thrown into the works. In February of 1916, the German army launches an absolutely colossal surprise attack on the French at the fortress city of Verdun. All of a sudden, the French are fighting for their lives.
And just like that, the entire reason for the Somme offensive gets turned on its head. It's no longer about this glorious war-winning breakthrough. Nope, it's now a desperate rescue mission. The French are bleeding to death at Verdun, so the British have to take the lead at the Somme, and the main goal now is just to draw German troops away and save the French army from totally collapsing.
Which brings us to the opening day of the battle, July 1st, 1916. This is the day the new plan meets a brutal, brutal reality. And it's a day that would go down in infamy, especially for the British Empire.
Okay, so the British plan basically hinged on one single thing: massive, overwhelming artillery power. For 7 solid days, they just pounded the German lines with over 1.5 million shells. The thinking was pretty simple. This bombardment would literally vaporize the German defenses, cut all the barbed wire, and the British infantry would then they'd just walk across and take the empty trenches. Simple as that.
But here's the fatal flaw. The British commanders had totally underestimated the Germans. See, the Germans had spent 2 years turning their trenches into fortresses. They'd built these incredible, deep, concrete-reinforced bunkers, some of them 30 feet underground, where the British shells couldn't touch them. So while all that artillery was raining down, the German soldiers just waited it out, deep underground in relative safety.
Then, at 7:30 in the morning on July 1st, whistles blew all along the line. The British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and started walking across no man's land. But instead of silence, they were met by a storm, an absolute hailstorm of machine gun fire from those untouched German positions. The cost for that single day? 57,470 British casualties.
Let that number just sink in for a second. Of those casualties, 19,240 men were killed. Entire battalions were just erased in minutes. To this very day, it remains the single bloodiest, most devastating day in the entire history of the British Army. An absolute catastrophe on a scale that is just hard to even imagine.
But here's the truly horrifying part. The disaster of July 1st wasn't the end. Oh no, it was only the beginning. The battle would rage on for another 4.5 months, turning into this monstrous, relentless, grinding machine of death.
At this point, any hope of a quick breakthrough is completely gone. So the Somme gets a new, much grimmer purpose: attrition. It becomes a war of body counts. The strategy is basically to see who can bleed out the slowest. Victory isn't measured in miles gained anymore. It's measured in how many of the enemy you can kill.
So the battle just devolves into this series of smaller but incredibly vicious brawls for tiny, specific objectives. Little woods, ruined villages, ridges. Places like Pozières and Delville Wood, which the soldiers grimly nicknamed Devil's Wood, became these infamous killing grounds where thousands upon thousands of men died for just a few hundred yards of mud.
But right in the middle of all this medieval-style slaughter, something totally new appears on the battlefield. On September 15th, the British unleashed their secret weapon, the tank. Now, these first machines were slow, clumsy, and they broke down all the time, but their arrival was a complete shock, and it was a terrifying glimpse of the mechanized future of warfare. By mid-November, the autumn rains turn the battlefield into an impassable swamp, and the offensive finally grinds to a halt. So after 141 days of pure hell, you have to ask, what was actually achieved? And my God, was it worth the cost? This is where the debate gets really intense.
When you look at the raw numbers, it's just staggering. At the very furthest point, the Allies had advanced about 6 miles. 6. For that tiny patch of ground, the British and French suffered over 620,000 casualties. The Germans, close to 500,000. We're talking well over 1 million men killed or wounded in total.
But here's the twist. Even though it was a tactical failure, no breakthrough, the battle had these huge strategic consequences. It worked. It did relieve the pressure on the French at Verdun. The British Army learned some incredibly painful but valuable lessons. And maybe most importantly, the German Army was bled white.
And you don't have to take my word for it. Just listen to what one of the German commanders, Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, said afterwards. He admitted that the Somme essentially destroyed the core of their experienced pre-war army. They could replace the men, but they couldn't replace that experience. The German army was never the same again.
So this leads us to the two big competing ideas about the Somme that historians still argue about. On one hand, you have the view that it was a futile slaughter, an epic failure of leadership. On the other hand, some argue it was a ghastly but necessary learning curve, a brutal battle that fatally wounded the German army and taught the Allies how to eventually win the war.
In the end, there's just no simple verdict. The Somme is this powerful symbol of both horrific failure and a brutal, bloody turning point. A battle that, at an almost unimaginable price, helped pave the way for victory 2 years later. Which leaves us with a question that's almost impossible to answer. Was it worth it?